My name is Brenda, and this is History Coles Notes. So let's get started. You know what I like? I like on a hot summer day to sit on my deck and have a nice cold sangria. Red is my favorite, and I make the most delicious but dangerous sangria on the planet. You will not make it to the end of one glass before you start losing feeling in your face. But if I lived in the early 1900s, making and drinking my delicious sangria would be illegal, and this was due to Prohibition. In the 1820s, a wave of religious fervor swept through the United States, and members of these groups started to attempt to legislate their own morality. As part of this, Massachusetts passed a temperance law in 1838. So what is a temperance law? It is a law that would make it illegal for anybody to partake in an alcoholic beverage. This first law banned the sale of spirits in less than 15-gallon quantities, but even though it was repealed 2 years later, it set a precedent. Maine followed in 1846 by setting their first statewide prohibition laws, and they further strengthened these laws by 1851. By the time the Civil War began in the United States, many more states jumped on this legal bandwagon, and by the time of the turn of the century occurred, temperance societies were commonplace in communities throughout the United States. They saw alcohol as a destructive force in families and in marriages. By 1906, a new wave of protests began concerning the sale of alcohol, which was led by a group that called themselves the Anti-Saloon League. Established in 1893, they viewed the saloon culture as corrupt and ungodly. They got a lot of support from business owners who saw prohibition as a way to increase their workers' productivity and decrease workplace accidents. Then in 1917, President Woodrow Wilson instituted a temporary wartime prohibition in order to save grain for producing food. That same year, Congress created the 18th Amendment, which banned the manufacturing, transportation, and sales of liquor for state ratification. This amendment received the support of 3/4 of the U.S. states in just 11 months. It went into effect the year later, and by October of 1919, Congress put forward the National Prohibition Act, which provided guidelines for federal enforcement of prohibition. Now, both local and federal governments, they struggled to enforce prohibition during the 20s. Enforcement was initially assigned to, believe it or not, the IRS. It was then transferred to the Justice Department, and then it went to the Bureau of Prohibition. It was enforced more strongly in the areas where population was more dense, and in the rural areas and the small towns, they got a bit of a reprieve. It did show very early signs of success with a reported 30% decline in alcohol consumption, but those who wanted to drink some sangria, they found ways around this. The illegal manufacturing and sale of liquor known as bootlegging went on for years. It was also during this time that speakeasies came about, which were stores or nightclubs that sold booze. The smuggling of alcohol across state lines and the unofficial production of liquor became a very popular pastime in private homes. It was these people that created what today is called moonshine or bathtub gin. You have one guess why it's called bathtub gin. Now that Prohibition was in play, the criminal activity associated with bootlegging, it skyrocketed. A great example was Al Capone, who was a famed Chicago gangster. He made a staggering $60 million per year from his bootlegging and speakeasies, which would be a little less than $80 million a year today. These operations fueled a rise in gang violence and demonstrated a distinct class difference, since due to the high price, the rich were the only ones who could afford alcohol. Soon, the costs of law enforcement massively increased, and by the end of the 1920s, support for prohibition was coming to an end. Adding to this, when the Great Depression hit, politicians started seeing the underground liquor industry as a place that they could create jobs and bring in revenue. By the time Franklin D. Roosevelt ran for president, he made his platform based on the removal of prohibition, and he did what he promised. When Roosevelt won the election, prohibition came to an end. In February of 1933, Congress adopted a resolution that proposed the 21st Amendment to the Constitution that repealed the 18th. Although few states continued to outlaw alcohol after all of this, all states abandoned their bans by 1966, Sangria gained its freedom once more. Now, the US wasn't the only place to have prohibition. Currently, alcohol prohibition is enforced in many Muslim majority countries, in Indigenous Australian communities, in some regions in India, and in certain northern communities in the Canadian territories. It also hasn't left the United States in its entirety. To this day, 10 states still contain counties where alcohol sales are outright prohibited. Luckily for me, I live in Canada and not in a northern community. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell so you can join us for more History Coles notes. Be sure to check out all the other amazing content that we have on our Horrifying History channel, and be sure to follow us on social media. It's there that you'll be the very first to hear about what's coming up in the Horrifying History universe, and you can connect with history-loving people just like me. You can find the links to our social media in this show's notes. Thank you all for watching again today. And until next time.